The scream shattered the silence like a blade through stained glass. A candle tumbled, its flame snuffed by the breathless gasp of a woman who hadn't spoken in hours. In the old stone convent, dim with dust and haunted air, Sister Magdalena stood frozen, her face pale, her hand clutching the edge of the wooden pew. The letter in her hand trembled, ink smudging under the heat of disbelief. "No," she whispered, a breathless denial to no one but God. Outside, thunder rolled low like the belly of a coming storm. The letter was unsigned. Just one line: "You let her die to protect your title." She folded, not like a woman kneeling for prayer, but like an ancient cathedral beginning to collapse. The others watched, silent, unmoving, as if her breakdown was a liturgy they'd long expected. The silence in the chapel was not peace. It was judgment. Years of silence had calcified around her heart like stone around a sea. Sister Magdalena once bore a different name, Isabelle, long before she traded satin for silence, love for piety. The letter clawed into that name like a forgotten hymn. She hadn't seen Anna's face in decades. A child's face. Eyes that once pleaded behind hospital glass, skin pale from too many needles, too many nights with no answers. "You said she was safe," Isabelle had told the man who wore a collar but wielded lies. Now the lie had come home. Every beat of her heart cracked something deeper. It wasn't just guilt. It was a reckoning. The chapel had not changed in 40 years, but the ghost of her failure had finally walked in through the side door. She had buried Anna's name beneath vows and veils. When the superior asked for volunteers to serve in silence, she went willingly, eager to become someone else, anyone but the woman who signed that release form. But guilt isn't absolved by robes. It's patient. It waits in the silence between bells and creeps through the cracks of your prayers. Magdalena remembered the night she was told the child had relapsed. No funeral, no goodbye, just a document, clinical and cold. They said it was better that way. She believed them. She had to. And yet, here she sat, decades later, punished not by the world, but by memory. The letter wasn't just a reminder. It was a resurrection. The weight of silence crushed her ribs with every breath. She rose slowly, as if the years had turned her spine to glass. The wind outside grew louder, like the dead calling her by name. She walked to the altar, each step a crack in her composure. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. The other nuns didn't move, like stone angels in judgment. Her knees hit the floor, not in worship, in collapse. Her voice, when it came, was broken glass. "Forgive me," she said, not to God, but to the girl who never got her birthday cake, the girl who waited for a mother who never came back. She screamed then, not loud, not theatrical. It was the sound of bones breaking under the weight of remembered choices. Outside, the storm reached its crescendo. Rain lashed the stone walls like penance from heaven. Inside, she remained kneeling, her body still but her soul unraveling. In her mind, she heard Anna laugh, just once, like a spark in the dark. It gutted her. The sound of innocence she'd never earned. A warmth she no longer deserved. She reached into her robe and pulled out the last photograph. The one she kept hidden in the lining all these years. A 5-year-old girl with a missing tooth and a sunlit smile. She kissed it, trembling. "You were never my sin," she whispered. "You were my salvation." For the first time, her voice didn't shake. It broke. Before she was Sister Magdalena, she was Isabelle Duval, daughter of a banker, promised to a man she didn't love, and pregnant at 17. The convent offered refuge, or so they said. A quiet place to carry her shame, away from the eyes of the elite. They gave her prayers, cold beds, and a new name. But they took her voice. When Anna was born, her cries echoed off the convent walls, sharp, urgent, alive. Isabelle begged to hold her. "Let her be baptized first," they said. She believed them. She had to. They told her it was God's will to give the child a better life. But it wasn't God who signed the adoption papers. It was Mother Agnes. And Isabelle, barely a woman herself, was made to watch her baby be led away, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. She screamed, but they called it hysteria. She never screamed again. They gave her a new habit and whispered, "Forget." Days became months, prayers became chains. She memorized psalms to distract herself from lullabies she would never sing. Isabelle died somewhere in that chapel, and Sister Magdalena took her place, obedient, quiet, righteous. But righteousness is rarely honest. At night, she clutched her own arms, pretending they were a child's. She imagined a girl with curls and a gap-toothed smile running toward her in the garden. Then she'd wake, soaked in guilt. They called her devoted. She called herself damned. And still, she prayed. Not for peace, but for numbness. If I can forget her, she told herself, maybe I'll be holy. But God never took the memory, only the joy. Years passed, and she rose in rank. The novices looked to her with reverence, calling her wise, disciplined. They never saw her tremble after Vespers, or the way she winced when children sang outside the gate. She visited hospitals, comforted the sick, but never entered pediatric wings. She claimed it was too noisy. The truth? The smell of antiseptic and juice boxes made her knees buckle. Every clipboard reminded her of the form she signed. She became a master of avoidance, cloaked in duty. But shame isn't a wound, it's a tether. Every time she tried to walk forward, it yanked her back. She started waking at 3:12 a.m. every morning, the time of Anna's birth. She'd sit in the dark, breathing through the silence, pretending it was just a coincidence. Then came the girl who shattered the stillness. Sister Claire, young, full of questions, stubborn with compassion. She reminded Magdalena of herself before obedience bled her dry. Claire spoke of justice, not just faith. She noticed things others ignored. One evening, she approached Magdalena after prayers. "Sister," she asked softly, "why do you never look at the children?" Magdalena's hand flinched, her breath caught mid-chest. She offered a vague smile, but the lie didn't land. "It's easier that way," she finally admitted. Claire didn't push. But the next morning, a drawing was left on Magdalena's cot. A crayon sketch of a nun holding hands with a little girl under a sunlit sky. No signature. Just hope, sketched in silence. That night, Magdalena dreamed for the first time in years. Not nightmares, dreams. She stood in a field of wildflowers, Anna running ahead, laughing without restraint. Magdalena called her name, but no sound came. Anna turned, her smile bright as fire, and mouthed something. I waited. When Magdalena awoke, the drawing was still in her lap, and her hands were still trembling. She rose before dawn and walked barefoot to the old bell tower. She rang it once, not for prayer, but for remembrance. The sound echoed through the convent like a call no one expected. Nuns stirred. Lights flicked on. But Magdalena stood tall. For the first time since she took the veil, she allowed herself to grieve. Not silently, but fully. The silence after the bell was unnerving. For decades it had only rung for death or disaster. But this morning, it had no funeral to accompany it. Just Magdalena's trembling hand and a heart too full to carry. The other sisters whispered, confused. Only Sister Claire approached. "You remembered something, didn't you?" Claire asked. Magdalena didn't answer. She only nodded once, then walked past her, robes brushing the stone like wind through grass. In the garden the roses were blooming, wild, bright, unrestrained. She knelt by one, ignoring the thorns. "She loved these," Magdalena whispered. Claire stood behind her, uncertain. "Who?" Magdalena looked up slowly, eyes wet but fierce. "The child I gave away, the one they told me to forget." It wasn't a confession. It was a resurrection. The next morning, Magdalena did something unthinkable. She entered the children's ward at St. Brigid's Hospital. The nurses paused. No nun from her order had stepped inside in over a decade. But she walked calmly, fingers clutching her rosary so tightly the beads left marks. A little girl with a bandaged head looked up and smiled. Magdalena froze, then knelt beside her. "Hello," she said softly. The child reached out and touched the cross around Magdalena's neck. "Is that yours?" she asked. Magdalena almost said no, but instead she nodded. "It is, and maybe it's time I shared it." The girl grinned, wide and innocent. It undid her. That smile, so painfully close to Anna's that it made her breath hitch. But she stayed. And for the first time, she didn't run from the memory. Later that day, she returned to her cell and opened a drawer untouched for 30 years. Inside, a bundle of letters, unsent, unfinished, unseen, all addressed to Anna. Some written in rage, some in heartbreak, others in numb, robotic scrawl. One simply said, "I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough." She spread them across the floor like relics. The ink had faded, but the emotion bled through. She chose one. The first, written the night Anna was taken, and read it aloud. Her voice cracked on every word. But still, she read, as if Anna could hear her now, as if these words, long buried, might finally plant something true. The walls didn't reply, but the air seemed to soften. That evening, the Mother Superior summoned her. Her office was colder than the chapel, walls lined with portraits of past abbesses, women who smiled without softness. "You've been unsettled," she said, folding her hands. Magdalena stood firm. "No, I've been silent." The abbess's eyes narrowed. "Sister, you know our rules." Magdalena nodded. "Yes, but I've learned some wounds need a voice, not a veil." A pause. Thick, tight, sharp. You are not here to remember the world," the abbess said. Magdalena met her gaze without flinching. "I am, because that child was my world." The abbess said nothing, just waved her off. But, as Magdalena turned, she heard it, quiet, brittle. "Was her name Anna?" The question cracked the air like old wood. Magdalena didn't answer. She didn't need to. Magdalena walked out of the abbess's office into night air that tasted of rain. The storm was far off now, just rumbles beyond the hills. She looked up at the stars, wondering how many nights Anna stared at the same sky. She sat on the chapel steps, knees stiff, heart slow. Claire joined her silently, handing her a small warm cup of tea. They didn't speak for a while. Then Magdalena said, "I wasn't a good mother." Claire shook her head. "No one gets to say that, but the child." Magdalena smiled faintly. She never got the chance. Claire looked up at the stars. "Maybe she will, in ways you can't see yet." Magdalena nodded. The grief didn't vanish. But for the first time, it wasn't alone. It had a witness. The letter hadn't appeared randomly. It was placed intentionally. Magdalena knew it now. She retraced her steps that morning and found something new tucked into her missile. A second envelope. Inside was a photograph. Faded, aged. A woman, mid-30s, tired eyes, auburn hair, holding a child with bright hazel eyes and a broken front tooth. On the back, "Anna and me. June 2004. Magdalena's knees gave. Her hands trembled so violently, the photo slipped from her grasp. The woman in the image was unmistakable. Claire. Younger, thinner, but it was her. Magdalena clutched the pew as a wave of recognition crashed. Claire hadn't just found the old pain. She had lived it. The child she mourned was not only remembered, she had grown. And she had a mother. But not Magdalena. She confronted Claire that evening. "You lied," Magdalena whispered. Claire didn't flinch. "I protected the truth." Magdalena held up the photo. "You knew her?" Claire nodded, voice tight. "She was my sister." The chapel fell silent between them. "My mother adopted her," Claire continued. "She never knew you, but she talked about missing someone. someone she couldn't name. Magdalena collapsed onto the pew behind her, breath ragged. She died believing I never came. Claire's eyes welled. She didn't hate you. She just felt unfinished. Magdalena broke. Not because the pain returned, but because the truth had breath. Anna had lived, laughed, loved, even if it wasn't with her. It wasn't the life Magdalena imagined, but it was real. And that was more than she ever dared hope. Claire handed her something else, a worn plush rabbit, yellowed and matted. Anna kept this until the end, she said. She called it Sister Ears. Magdalena took it like a relic, her fingers brushing the stitched cross on its chest. Did she ever ask about me? Claire nodded slowly. Sometimes, when she got sick, she said strange things. The woman with the bell voice, or the nun who forgot me. Magdalena winced. I never forgot, Claire whispered. I know. The rabbit weighed almost nothing, but in Magdalena's lap, it pressed down like truth. She wept, not for what was lost, but for what remained. A memory, a fragment, a proof that love, even when silent, had never been absent. That night, she entered the chapel alone. The candle she lit wasn't for penance, it was for presence. She laid the rabbit at the foot of the altar, beside the letter and the photo. 3 offerings. Her voice, once choked, rang clear. Anna, I failed you, not in love but in courage. She paused. I thought silence was sacrifice, but it was cowardice. The room was still. Then she sang, quietly, shakily, the lullaby she never got to finish. Her voice cracked, but she sang anyway. The words floated upward, brushed against the stained glass, and disappeared into the rafters. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. Every note felt like a step toward forgiveness. Not from others, but from herself. At dawn, the chapel bell rang again. Not for mourning, but for remembrance. This time the other nuns came willingly. Claire stood at Magdalena's side, holding the same photo. No words were spoken, but the air pulsed with meaning. One by one, the sisters lit candles. Some for Anna, some for their own unnamed ghosts. Magdalena watched the flames flicker, not as punishment, but as prayer. In the center of it all, she stood upright, no longer haunted, but humbled. Her pain hadn't vanished, but now it had a name, a face, a legacy. And within that ache, she found the seed of peace. A quiet whisper echoed in her memory. You were never forgotten. This time, she believed it. A week after the second bell, Magdalena requested permission to speak at the Sunday Mass. It had never been done. Nuns didn't give sermons, but rules felt small now. When she stood at the pulpit, she held no script, just Anna's rabbit in her hands. Her voice shook, but she spoke. For years I lived behind silence. I thought obedience would cleanse guilt. I was wrong. The congregation shifted, startled. I had a daughter, she said. Gasps followed. And I lost her, not because she died, but because I didn't fight. No one moved. Some wept. If you have love buried in shame, speak it. If you have wounds dressed in pride, open them. God doesn't need your perfection. He needs your truth. When she stepped down, the chapel was still, but it wasn't silent. It was holding its breath. After the Mass, no one spoke to her. Not out of judgment, but reverence. The silence felt earned. In the garden, she found Claire waiting beneath the rose arch. You were brave, Claire said. Magdalena shook her head. No, I was late. Claire placed a hand on hers. Late love is still love. For a moment, Magdalena just breathed. The roses around them swayed in wind that tasted of spring. She reached down and gently clipped one. Do you think Anna would have liked it here? Claire smiled. She would have run through these paths like she owned them. Magdalena laughed, and the sound surprised them both. Then let's keep them blooming, she said. Let's make a place she would have come home to. They began converting the old storage wing into a children's reading room. Magdalena led the effort. She painted walls, unpacked books, and hung wind chimes in the windows. It wasn't atonement, it was restoration. One afternoon, she found a journal Claire had kept. Tucked inside was a page labeled Anna's last words. Magdalena hesitated, then read, "I hope she wasn't afraid to miss me. I wasn't angry, just waiting." Magdalena sat on the unfinished floor, pages trembling in her lap. "She forgave me," she whispered, "before I even asked." The sun spilled through the half-installed glass, dust catching in the light like prayers mid-flight. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it finally made space for tomorrow. On the wall above the reading room's entrance, Magdalena hung 3 frames. One held Anna's photo, another her drawing, and the last, a mirror. "Why a mirror?" a novice asked. Magdalena smiled. "So every child who walks in sees someone worth remembering." The room opened weeks later. Children filled it with laughter. Their joy echoed across stone and stained glass, transforming the convent into something alive. Magdalena stood by the doorway each day, not as a guardian, but as a witness. Every child that smiled, every book read aloud, stitched something torn inside her. Redemption didn't come from robes or rituals. It came from echoes, the ones you finally dare to answer. That night, Magdalena returned to the chapel alone. She knelt, not to pray but to reflect. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the altar's brass base. "You didn't fail her," Claire's voice whispered in memory. "You just lost your way." Magdalena lit one last candle. For every mother too scared to ask for her child back, for every child who waited. The flame danced. Outside, the storm that once defined her silence was gone. Only moonlight remained. She placed Anna's rabbit on the pew beside her. "Stay a while," she whispered. "There's room now." And for the first time since Anna's birth, Magdalena slept through the night without waking. In her dreams, a child held her hand. And this time, she didn't let go. Weeks passed, and the chapel that once echoed only with ritual now held warmth. Children's laughter, garden songs, shared silence, each moment a piece of rebuilding. Magdalena found herself humming lullabies under her breath. The fear had dulled, replaced by something steadier: acceptance. One afternoon, she helped a young girl braid her hair before Mass. The child looked up and asked, "Did you ever want kids?" Magdalena paused. "Yes," she whispered. "I had one." The girl smiled without judgment. "You still do." Magdalena blinked back tears. She hadn't expected grace to come in such small doses, from such young hands. But that was its nature. It didn't demand grandeur. It slipped in, unnoticed, and stayed. Claire approached with a request to name the new reading room after Anna. Magdalena hesitated. "What if I'm not ready to see it every day?" Claire answered softly. "Then maybe it's exactly what you need." On the day of the naming, the convent hung a simple wooden sign: Anna's Light. No titles, no explanations, just a name written in love. When the ribbon was cut, Magdalena stood back. Children poured in, racing to shelves, laughing like bells. She didn't weep, not because she wasn't moved, but because her heart was full. Her grief had shape now. A name. Deep. A room. A future. The doubt that once clung to her like a shroud had finally loosened its grip. Not every sister welcomed the change. Some called it indulgent, disruptive to the order's sacred stillness. One confronted Magdalena in the hallway. "Are you sure this is faith, or is it just guilt?" Magdalena smiled calmly. "Sometimes they walk hand in hand, but one doesn't cancel the other." The nun said nothing more. Magdalena didn't need approval. Her redemption wasn't theirs to validate. That night, she wrote in her journal for the first time in decades, "I was not ruined by what I lost. I was reshaped by what I found." The ink didn't tremble. Her hand was steady. That was new. That was hers. Spring settled in with soft rains and the perfume of blooming roses. The convent, once cold and monastic, pulsed with life. Claire announced her intention to leave the order and become a pediatric nurse. "I want to be there, where the beginning hurts most," she explained. Magdalena nodded, both proud and pained. "Anna would have loved you," she said. Claire smiled. "She already does." They hugged, not as nun and novice, but as women forged in shared loss and chosen healing. That night, Magdalena sat under the rose arch, the wind warm against her face. Her daughter hadn't come back, but in 1,000 ways, she had never left. One final box remained in her cell, full of old journals, sealed letters, and the habit she wore when Anna was born. Magdalena carried it to the convent's riverbank, where silence met reflection. She opened the lid slowly, wind tugging at the corners of paper like eager fingers. One by one, she released the contents into the river. Not as penance, but as offering. The last item was Anna's drawing, the nun and child beneath a yellow sun. She hesitated, then smiled and kissed the paper. "You live here now," she whispered, touching her heart. As the water carried the memory away, Magdalena turned, lighter than she had ever felt. Not empty, just, finally, unburdened. Magdalena no longer counted the hours by bells, but by warmth. The morning sun rising through the chapel windows, the laughter of children echoing through the halls, the rustle of pages turned in. Anna's light. She taught the children about courage, not in sermons, but in gestures. A bandaged knee kissed without shame. A secret kept for safety. A tear wiped without judgment. She had become the kind of woman Anna might have run to. And that was enough. No plaque would carry her redemption. No scripture would quote her name. But the smiles she saw every day were scripture enough. Her legacy wasn't carved in stone. It was passed on through kindness, through touch, through presence. She kept one item, only one, from the river box, Anna's drawing. She framed it, not on a wall, but inside her prayer book. It lived there, pressed between pages that once condemned her silence. Now, those same pages held color. Life. Life. Forgiveness. One evening, a girl pointed to the drawing and asked, "Who's the little one?" Magdalena smiled. "Someone brave. Someone bright." The girl asked, "Are you the nun in the picture?" Magdalena thought for a moment. "I wasn't, but I became her." And that answer, simple, true, wrapped around the moment like a soft blanket. She no longer feared the question. She had become the answer. On the first anniversary of the bell's return, the convent held a silent vigil. No candles. No speeches. Just presence. The sisters stood together beneath the stars, each holding something dear. A letter, a token, a photo. Magdalena stood last, holding nothing. She didn't need to. Everything she carried was now inside her. She looked up at the night sky and whispered a name, Anna. It didn't echo. It didn't need to. The stars, bright and soft, seemed to nod in understanding. Claire stood beside her, silent. They didn't hold hands. They didn't cry. They simply stood together, witnesses of a wound that had finally scabbed over with grace. Magdalena grew slower with time. Her steps faltered, her hands trembled more, but her presence deepened. Children still ran to her, not out of novelty, but because she listened. She never rushed answers. She sat with the questions. And through her, they learned the strength of stillness. One child asked her, "Why don't you talk much during meals?" She smiled. "Because the silence feeds me too." Her wisdom didn't arrive in thunder. It whispered, in lullabies half remembered, in glances that held lifetimes, in the way she placed her hand on a crying child's back, reminding them without words that even lost things can be held again. Years later, when Magdalena passed, there was no marble monument, no grand obituary. But the children, grown now, returned. They came in quiet clusters, some bringing their own little ones. They sat in the chapel, beneath the same stained glass, and told stories not of sermons, but of how she made them feel safe, seen, real. Claire, now gray-haired and warm-eyed, placed Anna's framed drawing on the altar. Beneath it, a note in Magdalena's handwriting: "Some wounds stay quiet until they raise children of their own." The chapel bell rang once more, soft, slow, final. But it didn't mark an end. It marked a legacy. One built not on perfection, but on presence.